Well, welcome everyone once again to our podcast where we are unpacking health sovereignty, the goal of really giving our listeners, our patients, our clients opportunities to liberate themselves from the various um, constructs in our lives that are creating dependencies of all sorts. And so we're going through systematically what we call the five pillars of the body. And just to kind of recap and review, those are hydration, nutrition, exercise, sleep, and stress reduction. And in today's episode, we're going to go deep into sleep and rest and refresh and rejuvenation, all of those things that is a fundamental pillar. And just wanted to point out the profound intersection and interaction between all five of those pillars. So it's really not fair to even say that they're separate and distinct because they inform one another so much. And that's why they're each unique individual pillar. You can't really support the framework of your house of health without having all five of those, at least from the perspective of our body. So I'm once again joined by my good friend, Katie Armstrong, and we're just going to dive right into this great topic, which I know is near and dear to your heart as well.
Of course, I love how you were describing how these columns, these pillars, like they're woven together almost like a tapestry. And if you were to pull on one, it's going to impact all the others. And so, so often I think people see sleep as this ancillary topic, and if it falls apart, so does everything else. So I'm excited to sort of discuss with you from a medical perspective what you think people need to have their eye on as far as minimum and optimal, and sort of see if that overlays what I'm seeing in the world of clients.
Totally. I think minimum and optimal are the catchphrases or the watchwords, the potent words. I mean, there's been so many podcasts on sleep, and many of them are 2 or 3 hours long, and it's just kind of like this choose your own adventure. I think it really is important to say we want to leave the listener with some concrete, clear steps to take to help optimize this pillar rather than a more sort of nebulous treatment of this. So this podcast series really is a heart-centered intention for pragmatic, practical, real-world applications that have this sort of MVP vibe to them. Like, what's the minimum viable practice, protocol, procedure that I can employ to really, really nail all five of these? And so we sort of break each of the pillars down into 5 subsets. And for sleep, the first of those 5 is to find and identify and remove the sleep killers. With all the pillars, right, with all lifestyle, there's 2 sides of the equation. You can subtract things that are interfering with optimal, or you can add things that help enhance the optimal. And certainly, a lot of times we focus on, well, what can I do supplement-wise or medication-wise? What can I add into my armamentarium or into my lifestyle? But it's also so important to subtract the things that are getting in the way.
Well, I think that makes sense with sleep in particular, because in the end, sleep's a pretty natural activity. Like, you stay up long enough, even if you are not a quote good sleeper, you will eventually fall asleep.
Yeah.
And so the question ends up being, why are so many people having trouble now? And we just have a lot of modern distractions that are just jumping right in the way of this natural phenomena.
Totally. So if we just read the 5 components of good, healthy, optimal sleep first, and then we'll take them independently. Okay. So first, remove the sleep killers. Second, we're going to spend some time talking about the, I would say, massive differential from a salutogenic perspective, a health benefit perspective, of breathing through the nostrils of the nose and breathing through the mouth. So nose breathing versus mouth breathing, number 2. Number 3 is consistency. Very, very important. Number 4 is sound, the impact of sound on sleep. And then the last one is the impact of light on sleep and how that regulates so much of our chronobiology, our circadian rhythms, and so forth. So, how does that sound?
Sounds like a great path.
Great. So, yeah, well, let's dive in with the first one. Identify and remove the sleep killers. And we can immediately kind of make a list of those things. We might even frame this one as sleep hygiene in general. You know, like what are the things that we need to do to, on a very, very simple level, not leave the low-hanging fruit,
Sure.
on the table, so to speak. So, what comes up in your mind when you think about sleep killers?
Immediately screens.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Especially the fact that most people who are on their phones, it's not just the blue light, it's also the scrolling and just this perpetuation of brain activity that is counter to what we're wanting to see in the ideally hours leading up to sleep.
Yeah.
And, also just acknowledging that there's some, again, weaving together of all of these parts of the sleep piece, right? So like we're going to talk more about light.
Yes.
But is light in the way of you sleeping? We're going to talk about sound, but is there sound getting in the way of sleeping? These are some of the fundamental components to just stimuli. And are you being stimulated? Or are you being relaxed in the hours leading up to sleep?
Yeah. So just pulling on that thread of, how do we get our dopamine? And for so many of us, stress, which we'll treat separately in the next podcast, its own pillar, but stress and sleep are obviously intimately related, and we oftentimes have self-soothing mechanisms that interfere directly with our highest opportunity for deep, restful, rejuvenating sleep. For me personally, exactly what you mentioned has been my Achilles heel.
Technology?
Yeah. Specifically, I feel that I'm in the mode of I'm not quite tired enough to yet go to sleep, but it's 9:30 or 10 or 10:30, and I just want that last wind down. And so I have found myself in periods and cycles where my pre-sleep routine and ritual was anti-salutogenic. It was actually directly pathogenic. And it speaks to the unbelievable magnetic pull of scrolling. And I found myself, like, I don't really do Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat, but I can easily do YouTube videos for hours and hours and hours at a time. And then I realize, oh my God, now it's midnight and I've really screwed myself. Because as we'll talk about in terms of sleep architecture, those first 2 or 3 hours are where we get the majority of our deep sleep. And so if we push out and we say, we're going to scroll on whatever channel you like, into the 11 midnight 1 a.m. time frame, we're really shooting ourselves in the foot.
The way I like to frame that for my clients is you get credit for 2 hours for every hour of sleep before midnight. And even though that's a little too simplistic, I think it really helps people acknowledge, like, oh, what's the difference between going to bed at 10 versus 11?
Yeah.
If I wake up and I've slept the same amount of hours, it's just not actually the same. And so if you want to buy yourself an easy hour in your life, go to bed an hour earlier. It's not just a simple trade of time. It's actually a opportunity for better quality and better rest.
Totally. So what I have found incredibly helpful, and many of our cloud members have found incredibly helpful, is to have a little bit of a warrior's stance with respect to stopping the screens. So you pick that time and you adhere to that time with a bit of militancy. I think is really helpful. And to say, whatever, after 8:30 screens are off, or after 7:30 screens are off. And I'm really going to set up the flow of my day such that that is a sustainable methodology for me. And thereafter, amber nightlights, which we can talk about how to jerry rig those. They're not that easy to find, but they're easy to make, because, as we'll discuss, we don't want any narrow band light like the blues and the whites. We really want to move into the ambers and the reds, the sunset colors, right? So we are naturally wired to follow the rhythms of nature. And if you just think about, well, what are the colors of the sunset? That's a great guide. And that's why red and yellows and purples are generally better in the late evening. So I've found stopping the screens and going to an actual paper book. And, I have a little library, a little mini library next to my bed that has poetry. I love David White. I love Rumi. It has some great biographies and books that are likely to not be like stimulating. They're not, books on how to run a business or things like that necessarily. They're more calming and soothing and self-regulating. And combined with the light and the absence of the screens, I mean, that's been a game changer for me. And again, I'm certainly not reinventing this wheel. Many, many, many people found that to be helpful.
So I don't think we're all that different through our various stages of life. And I have a 5-year-old right now, and I'm the one in charge of her schedule. And I am, as you were describing, somewhat militant with the schedule. And it's not as simple as when is her bedtime. It's how do we stack her up for success for her bedtime. And it really does take a couple hours of conscientious thought and even like trial and error to figure out what works. But similarly, it's a matter of creating a little bit of value in the hours before bed, but not in a stimulating way. So like what I heard in your own choices is that what was calling you towards the screen was just maybe a chance to check in with the self, like an opportunity after a busy day to maybe get fed a little bit if you've been giving all day. But in choosing a screen, the risk, of course, is that that's been set up to make you want more and more and more and never feel satisfied versus a poem or a book that you like acknowledge is something that's kind of down regulating or maybe fulfilling in some deep sense, gives you that little nugget that you're looking for of fulfillment to then settle into sleep. And so the same thing's true with my daughter. You think about it, right? It's so common to have, the books before bed and to turn down the lights and to shift from overhead lights to a night light that's usually low. So again, we'll get into the details later, but the color is important, even where it's stimulating from above or lower down. And my routine's similar. So our whole house starts dimming about 2 hours before bed. And, like I'm casually turning off more and more lights as the moment of sleep is descending upon us.
Yes.
And it's mirroring nature because we are now often contained in a box. Mm-hmm. But how do we bring nature into our experience and honor it?
Totally. No, I love that. So other sleep killers besides scrolling, most people would pick the two great chemicals of our culture, which are caffeine and alcohol. And, many, many people we find lose their caffeine tolerance and increase their caffeine sensitivity in terms of how long it lasts in their body as we age. So many young people can literally wind down at the end of the day with a double espresso after dinner and still sleep okay. And that is not the case for most people in their 40s and 50s, that's for sure. Similarly with alcohol, your tolerance and the sleep disruption that alcohol impacts is significantly worse as we age, and there's many reasons for that. And there are ways that we can mitigate against that. I find that using glutathione is a very, very powerful kind of detoxifier of all kinds of chemicals, including those two. So sort of if we must, we don't want to use that necessarily as a Band-Aid, although it can be effective. But the bottom line is, as we reduce our dependence on those two chemicals, oftentimes our sleep improves significantly. And reducing caffeine helps with the first half of our sleep cycle, which is the really, really deep sleep phase. So the non-REM sleep phase. tends to, as you were alluding to, occur either up until midnight or a little bit after midnight. And then the second half from, let's say, 1 a.m. to morning time is really where we get more and more of our REM sleep, our dream sleep. So the deep sleep occurs earlier in the night cycle. The REM sleep occurs later. And it seems that caffeine is the disruptor of that first half, whereas alcohol tends to disrupt the second half.
Makes complete sense to me. And I just like want to shine a light on something you were saying about how your capacity to tolerate this changes over the lifetime, and recognize that if somebody is in a habitual state with these substances, it can, one, feel really confusing. Like, where is the demarcation line between it being okay and it not being okay?
Yeah.
But also recognize that if you have a certain habit of having coffee late in the day and still are able to fall asleep, you may not have the self-awareness to recognize that your sleep quality has actually changed. And I think alcohol is a tricky beast because it can actually support people with really stressful lifestyles in like relaxing at the end of the day, and maybe even support them falling asleep. And again, it's back to the sleep quality. And so even if it appears that you are fine, or appears that these things might be supporting you in some way, it's just an invitation to look a little deeper. And I do think some of the tracking mechanisms that people wear are bringing some insight into that. But there's also an opportunity to have like a deeper self-awareness and to not kid yourself into believing these things aren't having an impact. And maybe you just decide it's worth it. Yeah. But to do that really consciously.
Totally. I think there are real world trade-offs, and there are not necessarily healthy habits that we can occasionally bring into our lives and still feel that we're making wise choices in general. We're not going for perfection or puritanism necessarily.
And what I'm hearing when you say that is having a drink at New Year's Eve, having a drink on, birthday, if that's what you're called to do. And just recognizing maybe you need a little extra sleep or a little extra recovery in the days after.
Totally. And sometimes even the habits that we identify as truly harmful, we're like, there's a voice inside me that says, I'm an alcoholic. And I need to think about this in a binary way, literally black and white, yes or no.
Couldn't agree more.
I really should never drink again. Other things don't fit into that category. And you can say, 6 cups of coffee every morning are not serving me, but maybe 1 or 2 would still be okay. This is where I think the sensors are phenomenal, because you can literally see if you're starting out at 6 cups of coffee per day and you wear an Oura ring or a Whoop strap or an Apple Watch, and you can look at how are the different segments of my sleep cycles showing up in terms of quality.
Yeah.
And then gradually wean. That's a tough one to cold turkey, but you can gradually wean off of a very high volume of coffee to a much, much lower one and just see how much better you feel in your body, as well as how much, your sensors are displaying an optimized sleep quality.
And to feed off that nuance a little bit, I think the ritual of coffee and tea in the morning is actually equally as valuable to people as the substance that they're taking. And so the invitation to sort of find your balance with these things, I think is actually really beautiful, because you tell somebody like caffeine's bad, don't do it. And that can be very jarring because it might neglect some actual real value that person's getting from, like I said, the ritualistic experience, the sort of habitual, like connecting with self as you wake up and kind of shake off the cobwebs in the morning. But I'm very sensitive to caffeine. And so I went caffeine free for 10 years, but that felt pretty incompatible with my life as a mom. But my mix ended up being decaf espresso with, I really enjoy a product called Daily Dose, which is like a mushroom coffee that has like an actual coffee caffeine extract. For some reason, that's my sweet spot. And I think even sort of like carrying that through, like you were saying, look at your actual statistics, analyze how things are affecting you, and notice that that changes not only over your life, but as a woman, that might be different one part of their menstrual cycle to the next. And yes, that does require a certain amount of like either data analysis or self-awareness, but that's kind of the invitation here.
Yeah.
And similarly, like just to add one more detail, when you do these things during the day is just as important as the volume or intensity. So, I had a hard and fast rule, even in college, when I was consuming a decent amount of caffeine,
Yeah.
I couldn't have it after a certain time.
Yeah. What is that time?
For me, especially as an adult, like hard stop 3:00.
Oh, wow.
But that's honestly like very luxurious, and I would be rare to ever have an afternoon caffeine.
Right.
But absolutely will I not, unless I'm intentionally trying to stay up late.
Yeah.
Like for me, green tea at 7:00 is a guaranteed, like stay up all night for a concert.
Yeah.
That's not something I get to do very often anymore.
Totally. Well, and I think it also depends on your relationship to sleep in general.
Mm-hmm.
There are some people that sort of have the chronotype called the dolphin. There's the lion, the bear, the wolf, and the dolphin. And the dolphins are the ones that just naturally struggle with sleep. They have disordered sleep. It's hard for them to fall asleep. And for people like that, they have to be extra cautious. And I would say probably 10 a.m. would be the right cutoff for them. Other people are much more tolerant. They're more sort of bear-like in their sleep patterns. They don't have to be quite as regimented or careful. I also love the invitation to explore other forms of either what could replace the beautiful ritual of a warm cup of coffee. Maybe not exactly, doesn't have the crema and the foam just so and everything, but I really love the Boulder brand Rasa. Rasa makes coffee alternatives. They are herbal adaptogenic brews. They come in about, I don't know, they maybe have 10 or 12 different flavors. They even have a nighttime one that's called Calm that has magnolia extract and herbs that are more soothing for the people that are like, in the afternoon, I want something like that.
Sure.
And then for their morning brews, phenomenal. They even have a one called Dirty Rasa that's sort of for people that are weaning off of coffee or want to wean off of coffee to optimize their sleep. It has a little bit of coffee in there so you don't have the withdrawal effects so badly. So Rasa is great. I love matcha too. Still has caffeine, but significantly less so than coffee. Really beautiful kind of ceremonial brew almost.
And there's been some really great studies recently about the health benefits of a green tea, the health benefits of tea generally for bone density, some really interesting correlations. And for me, for example, like I said, a hard stop for 3 at caffeine, but like I should have been specific. Coffee is a hard stop 10 a.m.
Okay.
And I'm arguably even a dolphin, which just as you were speaking kind of reminded me like this isn't happening again in like an isolated way. It's talking about like how do all the choices that you're making throughout the day impact things. Like for example, like most of the women over 40 that I coach, I'm strongly encouraging they wait for caffeine till after they've eaten. Mm-hmm. How much and what you're eating, how much and what you're doing for exercise all impacts these things. Mm-hmm. So somebody's working out really heavily may be able to tolerate a little bit of extra caffeine past that 10 a.m. mark. Mm-hmm. But if it's a day off or you're dealing with high stress, there could be other elements that interact with that caffeine and have more of a negative effect on your sleep.
Big time, and vice versa too. So it's a, which way do you want to spin the wheel? Yeah. It could be a vicious cycle where all these pillars are actually negatively throwing the rest of them off, or it could be a virtuous cycle where they're feeding off of one another, creating optimal momentum for well-being. We know that interrupting that first half of sleep where you're getting the really, really deep sleep qualities massively throws off your metabolism.
I've seen some statistics that show like a 30% decrease in like metabolic health.
It's unbelievable. And so there's good data that substantiates this in terms of things like insulin sensitivity and the whole pre-diabetes kind of metabolic disorder, dysregulation. And then in a very, very kind of embodied way, the way that you take that from abstract data into, okay, but how does it actually make me feel the next day? I mean, most people feel way more bingy if they don't sleep well in the first half of the night, the next morning they're looking for ways to support their glucose, and they're oftentimes making, like, the amount of craving that we have, all of the satiety hormones and the way that they are negatively impacted by this. We literally like can set out to be like, no, this is my nutrition plan, and a bad night's sleep, particularly bad first part of the night's sleep, can completely throw that off and turns you into a ravenous beast. So,
and it makes sense. I mean, food is fuel.
Yeah.
And when you're tired, you need a little extra fuel. But the problem is you're simultaneously working with a system that's less efficient,
throwing off your endocrinology.
So it's just a double whammy.
Yeah, totally. So any other sleep killers you wanted to just throw out?
Well, it was interesting because I was reading a study recently that was talking about the difference between men and women and their needs for sleep. And it was a little bit counter to some other studies that I've read, because it was only suggesting that women only need a little bit more, like 10 to 30 minutes. But you start overlaying that with the fact that women have a tendency to take on more caregiving needs, and their sleep is more frequently interrupted. And so it actually ends up being that even if they don't need that much more, they need more time in the bed to get it because of sleep disruptions, known as little kids that are waking them up, or even, let's say, a partner that's in bed with them. So I think that I just wanted to shine a light on that, because some of these aren't even things we consider choices that can be disrupting our sleep. And that doesn't mean that they don't impact our health. And so having strategies around moderating those where we can, having relationships maybe with our like co-parent that is facilitating one parent getting a little more sleep than the other, or discussing with partners about ideal sleep hygiene, because somebody else's choices can be impacting our well-being and health.
Your partner is the sleep killer.
I'm a good sleeper, but I'm an extremely light sleeper. So
Totally.
I would, I could go corpse pose all night long and get 99% sleep quality. But as soon as somebody else is in the space with me, my sleep quality drops dramatically.
No, I mean, I laugh because I play that role in my house for sure. And, we have a pretty strong rule. We have a guest bedroom, and, my wife will tap me out the minute that I wake her up. It's like, we don't see what happens later. Hopefully he'll stop snoring, even with mouth tape, which we'll get into in a second. Sometimes I snore through that, and I would hate to play that role for her where I'm keeping her up. And so I get the tap and I'm like, that's my cue. I'm going to go in the guest bedroom.
I think those are great conversations to have. And as a still relatively new mom, I don't have the opportunity to tap out my daughter.
No, you don't.
So then there has to be other strategies.
Yep.
And some of that is simply teaching her and helping her maximize her sleep quality.
For sure.
But then other strategies around like catching up, or, having that relationship with somebody else to kind of make up the lost time.
Totally. Naps can be enormously rich in terms of some of that catch up. What's your relationship with naps?
It comes and goes through different times in my life. I could not have made it through law school training for triathlons without naps.
Yeah.
I mastered the 15 and the 45-minute nap.
Yeah.
And I think that's, again, this recognition that sleep is a teachable and learnable activity, and that you can set yourself up for failure or you can set yourself up for success, but that there's an element of transition to any new habit. So I remember when I was learning how to nap, those first half a dozen times where I really never fell asleep, but over the course of probably a few months, I could fall asleep within 3 minutes. And I knew that, and I could set an alarm for either 18 minutes or 48 minutes, depending on what I had time for. And they were a game changer. There's something about, and you'd understand probably more the mechanisms, but dropping all the way in to a sleep, even for a short period of time, is like a reset. And when massive reset. I see that with kids too. Like my daughter's beyond her napping years, but if she takes even a 1 minute nap in the car or on an airplane, we're up for 3-4 more hours that night. But for me, I would often try to nap if I was going into an evening race, because it would be the difference of 30% like oomph and performance. It was what gave me a reset for an evening workout after a long day, or if I was studying for finals. So, I mean, I'm a huge fan of naps. You just have to learn your boundaries there too.
Totally.
I couldn't nap past 4 o'clock or it would ruin my sleep.
Yeah.
And ideally even earlier than that is better. I mean,
Hmm.
you were a triathlete as well. I mean, you're still training, but were naps something you utilized?
Absolutely. I mean, I think so. We can look at it from three different ways. Culturally, like we have infinite amounts of data on how the Spaniards and the Italians
The
and
siesta.
do the siestas and many of the Latin cultures. We have our own personal experience, and then we have the scientific studies. The scientific studies are very compelling. The best done studies suggest that it's something like a 30% improvement in cognitive function, 50% improvement in wakefulness for the next part of the day. That's the latter half of the
Yeah.
day, if you get something like a 20 to 30-minute nap in. So I think all roads pretty much point to the salutogenic benefit of a nap. It should be more than a luxury. I don't think in our culture it's as well assimilated in the American culture as it is elsewhere. But I'm a super fan of it. It definitely, especially when you're training a lot or working long hours, it can be a lifesaver. I think the only time that it would be something to be cautious with or perhaps avoid is if you already struggle with insomnia, because then you can be oftentimes front loading, the time that you should be sleeping in bed, and the nap can interfere with that a little bit. But other than that, uh, man, I really wish we did a better job of in, integrating a nap culture into our society.
So you may or may not know this, but I'm a women's health advocate. And so I do a lot of researching how other cultures are handling
Mm-hmm.
specifically women's health in the sort of perimenopause, menopause space. And this is a piece of information that came to me through that, where we were seeing a huge drop off in women over 50 from the workforce. They just
Mm-hmm.
weren't able to tolerate the traditional 9 to 5 schedule and the work environment in the same way. And some of the studies out of Europe were such that if you allow for things like individuated temperature controls
Mm-hmm.
or naps,
Mm-hmm.
it can actually completely reverse that and actually not only allow sort of a more consistent with male, like maintenance of the work schedule, but also like optimal performance. And so then in that moment, I'm asking myself, well, what would happen if we allowed all people to sort of
Mm-hmm.
maximize their sleep, maximize their cognitive function for even just idea creation around, new ideas for their work. So I'm all for flex hours, flex days, because I think that everyone's just rhythms are a little different. But if we can work with people on sort of maximizing their health, I think it will ultimately create a healthier, happier society.
Yeah, I can't agree more. Um, it's not always so easy to do. How did you do it? Like, so here you were in law school, right? You're training for triathlons, you're working your butt off in all the ways, burning calories and needing a break midday. And did you nap in the library? Did you go to your car? Did you go back to your house? How did you like pragmatically incorporate that?
Pragmatically, I started doing naps in college and continued them in law school, and I just spent a decent amount of time working my calendar.
Mm.
So I would anticipate like openings and breaks. And so in law school I had 2 or 3 days a week where I would be home by 1:30, and
Mm-hmm.
so I would essentially use that as an opportunity to drop into a nap right when I got home, and then I'd have that whole second half of the day.
Mm-hmm.
That enabled me to go run in the dark when it was super hot. It
Mm-hmm.
enabled me to have a second work study session. When I was an actual lawyer working in a law firm, I would take naps on the floor in my
Yeah.
office. But I didn't mind doing that. And I had
Yeah.
trained it as a skill, so it wasn't difficult for me to do that. I think that would have been challenging to start that habit. I It's interesting. My father was an orthopedic surgeon. Residency, they would take naps in rooms in the building.
100%.
I sometimes wonder why that isn't a more common practice for other professions, an acknowledgement that we really do need like a moment off
Yeah.
if we want to actually be on.
Yeah.
It's not sustainable in my mind to just be like grinding from 9 to 5. People are either going to dissociate into their phones or lose efficiency. So we need to give people more opportunity to take care of themselves.
Yeah. I mean, I think it takes some outside the box thinking like, wait a minute, so I work an office job or, in my case, I'm in the clinic. You know what? Over lunch, there's always a free exam room. You could close the door and get that 20 minutes in. And I wouldn't say I do that every day, but I certainly do that from time to time. And it's always rich, nourishing, feels
Absolutely.
amazing. And, I just want to also highlight the other sleep killer that's for sure a big one for many, many people is irregular sound, loud noises. And so I always have noise canceling earbuds. I find them super, super good. I use the Bose ones. I have the over ear and the in ear ones. And then an eye mask is great.
I've been using an eye mask for
Yeah.
20 years. That was a key
Yeah.
piece for me with naps because you start having a Pavlovian experience with an
Exactly.
eye mask.
Yeah, it's so good. So beautiful. Maybe we move to nose breathing, and we don't have to, go too far into this, but suffice it to say that there are certain mucous membranes in our body that have this almost magical quality in that they produce not just chemicals, so we're talking about cells now that line the mucous membranes of our sinuses and our nasal passages, to not only do the things that all cells do, but they also have this very unique feature where they release nitric oxide gas into our airways. And very notably, our mouth does not have those cells. And so you only get this effect, this nitric oxide effect, that you can inhale into the lungs and from the lungs gets into the bloodstream and goes throughout the entire body, only through nose breathing, not through mouth breathing. The nitric oxide, when it enters the lungs, dilates the airways, so you get more airflow, and then it enters the bloodstream where it dilates the blood vessels. So you get a really significant drop of blood pressure. And the benefit of that, it has just a legion of cardiovascular effects that are also salutogenic. So you get sort of a free blood pressure regulation. It also dilates the blood vessels primarily in the brain, so you get more blood flow through the brain while you're sleeping. So there's all sorts of evidence, still preliminary, but it suggests that nose breathing is a cardiovascular benefit. It is a neurovascular benefit, potentially preventing things like dementia. And it overall has an anti-inflammatory benefit. So really, really kind of almost shocking advantages to doing the thing that most of us don't do. Because most of us, for many reasons that start with when most kids are weaned from the breast, and many kids don't ever nurse, the different kinds of nipples and things that we use for formula bottles alter our jaw structure in such a way that most of us in the United States become sort of almost obligate mouth breathers. If left to our own devices, we will breathe through the mouth in the vast majority of cases, through the vast majority of the night. And, one way to get around that is to do another super simple habit behavior, which is to mouth tape.
Very popular right now.
Very, very popular. What's your experience with it?
I have never used it, so it might be more valuable for you to share your experience.
Yeah.
But I do recommend it for clients, and I know a lot of friends that really enjoy it.
So let me also add that there are many dentists, many progressive, naturally inclined dentists, that find that when you keep the mouth closed during those, 7, 8, 9 hours of sleeping, the effect that has on the oral microbiome is so impactful that there's a significant reduction in cavities and dental caries.
I've heard that the drying out and the bacterial changes are just not ideal.
Correct. So, A, if we want to prevent cavities, B, if we want to optimize our cardiovascular and neurovascular system, and also to privilege and optimize general sleep, because it doesn't eliminate snoring, as I mentioned in my case, but it does reduce snoring too. It's one of the first things that I recommend for people who tend to have like a mild sleep apnea. If they have a AHI index in the, let's say, 5 to 10 range, which is kind of mild sleep apnea, oftentimes an oral device in the mouth, which kind of pulls the jaw forward a little bit, which also has a mouth guard anti-bite function, plus mouth taping over that is enough to optimize that sleep. So many, many, many reasons to implement mouth taping. I've tried so many mouth tapes. I've found that many of them, if you get them on Amazon, come from China, and they have immediately, when you open the package, this chemical off-gassing, and I'm like, that's the last thing that I want to put on my face. So I use something called Dream Tape, which is made in the USA, works great. They have 2 different sizes. And even when you have a little bit of stubble on your face as a guy, they still work great. So I'm a fan.
That's great. Do you mind me sharing a couple of other techniques I've used to...
Sure.
Well, when I weaned my daughter, I similarly noticed that she was starting to snore a little bit, and I knew her father had some sinus issues. Yeah. And so I was just very mindful, and I would actually do like pressure point massage and lift her cheeks and like create space in her sinus cavity. And I would do it for a few minutes, like a few seconds even, at the beginning of her starting to snore at the beginning of the night, and she would stop completely. And now, having done that for what was a year, 2 years,
amazing,
it's gone. And I realized I do the same thing to myself when I first lay down. I essentially do some stretching in my face, massage my face, and create opening. And I have started in the last few years using a saline spray, which people have different opinions on that. But for me, it assures that my nasal passages are really clear. And if I've removed obstacles to my natural breath cycle, I tend to only breathe through my nose. So I just encourage people to not accept their current state and to at least try things. Like you said, you had tried a whole bunch of other things and nothing was necessarily working. You tried a bunch of different tapes and found the one that made sense for you. But just encouraging people to not accept their fate. They're often unusual, subtle habits. Like even I've found when I'm lifting, if I'm smiling while I'm lifting, it seems like it's actually strengthening the muscles of my face. And I observed my father become someone with sleep apnea over time. And it seemed to coincide too with like less physical strength in his face. And so might it go the other way around?
Totally. Well, I mean, there's a incredibly interesting study, obviously a small number of people, but it suggests that playing certain wind instruments really, really improves these mild to even moderate sleep apnea syndromes, and nothing more so than the didgeridoo. That's like
makes complete sense.
Yeah. So for people that are looking for a new hobby, that may be a great way to do it. You also mentioned that some people, like your husband, don't have great airflow through the nose, and that may be a reason for them to doubt whether or not mouth taping could be a solution for them. What we've found is that many people start out that way. They're like, I don't really have a lot of airflow, but after even a few nights, literally the structures of those air passages can remodel, because your body privileges breathing to such a high degree.
Absolutely.
That it's way more plastic and malleable up there than we would sort of intuitively believe. And so, I definitely encourage people to try it.
Excellent.
Yeah. So the third one is consistency. We've already kind of talked about that, but depending on your chronotype and depending on the way that your sleep architecture is naturally wired, without exception, having a relatively regular bedtime really seems to be important. What have you found in your clients and in yourself?
I may have even said this in one of our other talks, but morning routine and evening routine are the bookends for a healthy life. And assuring that you have a certain methodology and rhythm to not just the time you go to bed, but the time leading up to when you go to bed. And similarly, having something in the morning, it just allows a pulse and an ease with which I then, or my clients can then make choices that not only does it improve your sleep, but I think it stabilizes all of your daily choices and habits.
Yeah, totally.
And I've, a little trick, if this is something where you're all over the map, start with a wide range, like a 2-hour bedtime, and start narrowing it over time. And I've also found that it's much easier to move somebody's bedtime. If, let's say, there's someone who goes to bed like midnight at 1:00 and they're wanting to get it down to that 10:00 hour, it can be easier to do it slowly and gradually, unless there's some event like travel or a big workout or maybe an interrupted night's sleep that has you more fatigued. A big jump can actually be very tricky for people, but if they do just a 15 to 30 minute increment over the course of 4 or 5 days and sort of wiggle their way back, it's one, requiring some discipline to sort of put a limit, which is part of the skill of having a bedtime that you have to sort of learn and grow through. But it also doesn't shock the system because it's very, it's when somebody tries a new bedtime, but they don't sleep so well, it doesn't exactly fortify that as a new routine. And so I found that has better success rates for change to do it gradually.
Do you set a limit on wake time too?
I mean, in the real world, most people have something that's getting them up at a certain time. So that is a little more baked in, I've noticed, for most of my clients. But I think your bedtime starts in the morning, which is why I talk about those bookends. Like you can't assume a new bedtime and have it be 3-4 hours earlier if you woke up at 10 a.m. Yeah. It's never going to work.
Exactly.
So I actually, like, when somebody's starting that new nighttime routine, it's actually first talking to them about when are you waking up.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. And even moving that wake time back, to an earlier half an hour or an hour, I think builds up that sleep pressure so that the following night you're actually much more likely to be tired enough to fall asleep at that new selected bedtime and adhere to that rhythm.
And accepting that there's discomfort in transition.
Totally.
Transitions change. It's not always easy. It can be quite frustrating or annoying. And so, like, accepting that and actually seeing that frustration and annoyance can, in especially the case of sleep, be helpful. Like if you're tired, it'll be easier to go to bed earlier.
Totally. What are I want to talk a little bit about consistency within inconsistency. So let's say you're traveling across several time zones. Let's say you're traveling to Europe or Hawaii or Asia or something like that. Of course. I think there's ways of managing that. I mean, I know that you and I both like to travel, and many of the people that we work with are always coming to me and saying, "My God, I'm going to be in Munich, but I'm on a work trip. I'm only going to be there for a few nights. What do I do?" And, I found that there's some things that are really, really potent. What do you think in your kind of experience?
We've had a conversation about this before, and our techniques are a little different just because my form of travel tends to be a little different. Like, I lived in Indonesia most winters, and so I was having to shift as many time zones as there are.
Yeah, to the other side of the planet.
Yeah. And so for me, it was always get up and see the sunrise and work out. If I saw the sunrise and worked out my very first day, it could be gentle. It didn't have to be much. And then I similarly saw the sun set. Yep. It was almost immediate that I'd be recovered. Now, I don't know if that would be the same for a 2-3 day turnaround. I don't know if I would quite be able to ease into it the same way. So I'm very interested in hearing your techniques.
I think that's probably the second most important thing.
Okay.
The first, that's a universal. Like, no matter where you are, greet the sun. Because guess what? You're going to be presumably trying to interact with other human beings during their normal schedule in whatever country you happen to find yourself in. And so greeting the sun tells your brain, okay, it's morning time and now I'm ready for my day. But even more important than that is if you want to regulate, like if you want to get accustomed from a circadian perspective to the local time, you have to look at when the plane lands. And if you're flying from, let's say, Colorado or New York to Europe, almost all of the flights leave in the evening and land in the morning. So that means you're landing at the beginning of the day. Ergo, you damn well have to sleep on the plane. Come hell or high water, use whatever tool you need to use. And this is where sleep medications are very, very helpful. I'm not a big fan of continuous sleep medications forever, but there's certain times when they're very, very helpful. And so taking Ambien or an alprazolam or trazodone or what have you, or even an over-the-counter sleep aid, when that flight leaves at, let's say, 5 p.m. from Denver, and it's going to arrive at 8 a.m. local time in Europe, you've got to hit the ground running. And if you've been up all night watching movies or reading, and you land the local time in the morning, it's going to be a hideous kind of a day trying to get through. If you're flying the opposite direction, it's usually the other way around. Those flights usually leave earlier in the day and then land in the evening. Same thing if you're coming back from Europe. Typically you're leaving around noon or sometime in the early afternoon and arriving at 3 or 4 or 5 p.m. local time. That is much less important to sleep. In fact, I would recommend not sleeping because you're going to arrive pretty close to dinner time, have a nice dinner, and then go straight to bed. So those things are key. If you nail that flight sleep and you arrive and then you greet the sun as soon as you get off the plane, usually the amount of jet lag is just radically diminished.
So great tips.
Yeah. And then, the bare feet also plays a big role. We talked about that before. Taking the shoes off and walking around in the grass just kind of helps ground the body. And using sleep aids like melatonin can be helpful in that setting in particular.
It does occur to me that we skipped one kind of interference for sleep that's related also to kind of reorienting yourself if you've changed time zones, and that's food timing.
Yeah.
If you eat in the last couple hours, last hour or two or even 3 hours before bed, it can really interrupt your sleep quality or ability to fall asleep. That's something that I try to encourage my clients to change very early on. Mm-hmm. So even if they're a later bedtime person, still looking at the pre-sleep window.
Totally.
But when you're traveling, it can kind of be reversed, like in the sense that I always encourage my clients to take their own food on planes and to be sure that they stay very, very hydrated, but trying their best to kind of match up food to where they're going and essentially not just keep eating if they should be sleeping. It's a similar kind of response. If the body's feeling really labored with a lot of food, it's going to have a harder time falling asleep in the new time zone.
For sure. That's particularly hard in Europe, where oftentimes the restaurants don't open until like 8 p.m.
But they had a siesta.
Exactly. Yeah, so it sort of shifts everything forward a bit.
Yeah.
Great. Well, we've already been talking about the importance of light. I think that, again, we're talking about this whole health sovereignty premise is that these things take very little time, very little effort, and cost almost no money, right? Very, very simple routines that we can employ without drastically changing our lifestyle. I would put greeting the sun at the very, very top of that list in terms of overall impact, getting those early morning rays on the retina, not staring directly into the sun, obviously, but looking in the direction of it. And that is definitely a routine that I uphold the vast majority of mornings. Typically at least 5 minutes. If I can do it longer than that, I'll oftentimes do my whole morning routine on the grass facing towards the sun, and that can last 20 to 30 minutes. But tell us about your kind of general relationship with that.
Given that I have a 5-year-old, I find all of my morning routines to be truncated, but I always walk outside barefoot. It's the fastest, easiest way to sync up with the day and the sun. And I've mentioned how I'm always turning lights off at the end of the day. Well, in the morning, I'm opening all the windows and I'm shining light into the space. And sometimes my daughter joins me, sometimes she doesn't, but I'm wanting to at least get her used to there is a action that you take to sync up with nature, and that, you know, you need to make that a consistent action. And I noticed that the days I maybe forget to open the windows for her, it's much harder to get her to school on time. Right. So she's my witness. Like she's how I observe these habits kind of like in a very raw way. And they're a really great reminder that the same thing is happening to me. I just don't have somebody like controlling all these details. I have to have that agency myself.
Oh, that's fascinating to see how your child just responds to all of these inputs that are basically mimicking the vast majority of the history of humanity, the Homo sapien species. We grew up close to nature. And the more we fortify ourselves against that, the more dis-ease there is, right?
Absolutely. And it's interesting because, you know, the seasons change and the length of time that there is light is different. And I know a lot of people have more issues with insomnia during the summer when the days are so long. I noticed that even with a face mask, you know, we're in a place that doesn't have light blocking curtains at the moment. My sleep is slightly disrupted and it's much harder to go to bed on time, quote, on time. And I've wondered, like, is that this natural invitation to kind of have a later bedtime, maybe sleep in a little bit more in the summers? But when we have this consistent work schedule, consistent school type schedule, it makes it more difficult. And it's just this invitation for me to ask myself, like, you know, how can I be as in sync with nature and listen as much as possible? When and where am I willing to push back? And how do I do that in a way that feels in alignment? But I'm curious if you've noticed any difference with your patterns through the seasons or how you handle that.
Yeah, boy, that's a tough one. I mean, it is much, much harder to get up early, do the barefoot walking, and greet the sun in the winter. But I still try my best. I'm generally not biking to work when there's snow on the ground, but I am going barefoot in the snow, and I am trying to do that around sunrise, which is much, much later in the winter. But I'm also not having a, 90-minute bike ride that morning. So I think it's, to your point, doing the very, very best you can, and just knowing that the more of that we can do within the confines of reality, we do our best, and that connection with nature when it's light, but also when it's dark, when it's sunny and warm, but also when it's cold, we just need as much exposure as possible. And I really, really privilege that in my life as much as I can.
And just because we haven't said it directly, in your sleep environment, controlling as much light as possible, like even subtle things like a bright clock or certain fire detectors and things like that. When I work with people who have sleep issues, we analyze their space. Some people need to do unusual things like move their bed into the middle of the room because the subtle noise or light of something that can't be eliminated is enough to be perpetually irritating them. And I think that if you don't catch those things early and they start to become like a cycle of, like we were discussing, like a snowball of negative behavior, you have a few nights where you don't sleep that well, you start worrying about not sleeping well, and it just can go poorly fast. But similarly, if you start addressing these things and there's a mild improvement, you start then recognizing other areas you can improve and start learning what's best for you, because nobody's the same.
Totally.
We're all a little different.
And it requires that flexibility. Back to the chronobiology and the chronotypes. The wolves are the night creatures, people that tend to stay up later and then sleep in a little bit longer. And that can be super tricky when sunrise is at 5:30. And if you're like, no, I really do best when I wake up at 6:30 or 7, And if you don't have some kind of blackout blinds or an eye mask or some way to mitigate against that early morning light, that can really mess you up. So I think those types of things are immense investments,
Yeah.
like immensely helpful investments. Blackout blinds, they sell them now at Lowe's and Home Depot. It doesn't have to be that expensive. And an eye mask is 30 or $50, right?
I'd say about 30% of my clients end up buying just an old clock, one that doesn't tick, that doesn't have lights to it, so that they don't have to keep their phone next to their bed as a tool. And we've talked about tracking as a beneficial tool, but I will say I can't sleep with my trackers on. Even like I used a Whoop and I could put it on my ankle so that the light wasn't bothering me much, but I still noticed a reduction in my sleep quality utilizing these tools. And so again, recognizing your own vulnerabilities and recognizing that subtle things can make a difference, and being willing to choose your rest, because we haven't gone into this as much this time around, but if your sleep is impacted, every other system in your body is impacted, and you cannot make up for chronic sleep deprivation with anything other than sleep.
That's right. And your body tries to catch up, but it never does perfectly. So yeah, it's creating a real stake in the ground that says, I'm going to prioritize this in my life one way or another, and I'm going to figure out the best way to do that for me as a unique individual. So important. So kind of taking us to the home stretch here, a few words about sound. I mean, the first thing to say is that can be a sleep killer of its own right, as I mentioned earlier. And so having some way of protecting against that, I'm super sensitive. I personally am a white noise lover. I always have some sort of a fan going or something like that. So I guess the first thing to say about sound is to protect yourself against unwanted sound. Wanted to go back to one thing that I forgot to say is that that's also super important. Temperature. We need to drop our core body temperature about 1 degree centigrade in order to actually fall asleep. And there's various mechanisms to help make that happen, biologically, physiologically. But we can also be fighting an uphill battle if we're in too hot of a room. So regulating the temperature is another key.
What's your ideal temperature?
I don't know if I've measured it in Fahrenheit, but it's just enough to feel cool, a little bit cool. And it obviously depends on whether it's winter or summer, but certainly below 70. How about you?
It's changed over time. I used to be much more tolerant of a warmer environment. And when I'm living in Indonesia, where there's often not air conditioning, I can tolerate warmer. It's like I acclimatize while I'm there. But currently I like a 66, 67 degree room. And because I'm a light sleeper, I benefit from not like a true weighted blanket, but a somewhat heavy blanket on my chest, which adds warmth, which means I have to be even cooler.
Yep, totally. Yeah, so cracking the code on the temperature is really important. Back to sound. Anything else you want to say about things like white noise or, earplugs or other tools?
Sure. I say this often. Every body is different. And so it's learning your tools, and I think practicing them. I find earplugs and eye masks and things like that to be incredibly useful in new environments, but I personally don't enjoy, especially an earplug, consistently. Like I find that that's an irritation and not a support. And I think that you have to sort of look at your whole life and ask yourself, are you somebody that's switching environments a lot? If so, bringing in these tools that sort of create a consistent experience can be really useful. When I traveled a ton with work, I found that my ritual around sleep became really stabilizing. Like I use a foam roller before bed, the same sort of like beauty care treatment. And then I used pillows to prop myself up in the same way. So even if I was in a new bed that I didn't recognize, or there's sounds that were different, there was this other thing creating consistency. And so consistency for me on all fronts tends to just create like a sense of thriving.
Totally.
But whether white noise is irritating to you or whether it's filling in the gaps to avoid those irritations, it's extremely personal.
Yeah.
And it can change over the time, like in your life. If you're in a high stress time, your cortisol might be riding higher, at which point things that irritate you may wake you up, and in a more relaxed state, they may not.
Yeah.
And even with nature, you adjust. Like, you get to Bali and the cacophony of sounds from the rainforest are pretty disruptive for the first few days. But after a couple months living there, you know the 3 a.m. rooster and you know the 5:30 rooster, and they're just your buddies, and they don't really do anything other than kind of connect you with nature. So it's just a matter of analyzing for yourself, are you rested? And if you're not, start looking at all the things that we described and eliminating the distractions and incorporating some of the support to find your sweet spot.
I love that. And then being patient with yourself and not fighting. Like, I found a particular posture is critical. It took me a while to acquire it. I will still have bad nights of sleep.
Yeah.
And how we relate to that, I used to get very frustrated. I'm like, oh my God, I got a big day. I got to get up soon. And here I am, sleepless. Now I try to the best of my ability, take a stance of, what an amazing time to do some yoga nidra. What an amazing time to work with my mantra a little bit. And rather than fighting it, to almost receive it as a time to work on other parts of the brain that actually we can help promote better sleep more quickly by utilizing. And, being frustrated about the fact that you're not asleep is never helpful. I know this is something that you know a lot about. Yeah. Have you used yoga nidra practice in your own life or with your clients?
I have. I think breath work of all varieties can be really useful for changing mood and changing perspective. But I'm really glad we got to this, because you can do all the things and still have sleep issues, whether it's chronic or occasional.
Yeah.
And when I was weaning my daughter, I've talked about this before, I had a lot of hormonal imbalances and flux, and I went through about a 3-month period where I would have hours every night I was awake, but it didn't trigger chronic sleep issues or additional anxiety because I have a practice. So whether it was some version of like a gratitude practice or meditation, or I started turning to some of my spiritual books on tape and just using it as an opportunity to like passively listen, it was an odd gift. It seemed to come at a time where I was able to actually use the invitation for more practice to deepen my practice, because something was being asked of me.
Exactly.
I was being asked to show up more in a way that only that true solitude and like deep, I don't know if I want to call it contemplation because it's something beyond the mind, but so often I think sleep shows up when there's something else that needs to be addressed. And so if you use that time to subtly address it, there's some magic there. Hard thing to teach.
Hard thing to teach. It's again, the way that we relate to that. And I love the way that you frame that. I mean, is there something good that's coming out of that? I mean, that sounds almost inhumane to tell someone who has chronic sleep problems. But I have personally found it to be very helpful to be like, what's the intelligence that's trying to come through here? And maybe it's something as simple as like, you idiot, you drank too much wine last night.
Yeah.
But other times it's like, no, there's some unprocessed stuff that is now showing up in the middle of the night. Who can't relate to that? Some stressor or rumination that is asking to be seen, is asking to be addressed.
And to speak a little bit more to the practice you asked me about, I mean, there are lots of audio recordings that you can do that sort of speak to laying in corpse pose and like thinking about different parts of the body and moving energy in different ways through the body, or incorporating breath work associated with that and just a certain way to relax the body. But there's something, I don't want to say it's equally as restful as sleep, it's somehow different. but it's a meditative state that allows for rejuvenation. And when I was just learning to nap, back to that part of our conversation, that's largely what I was doing.
Mm-hmm.
And over time, I sort of learned I can put my body to sleep.
Mm-hmm.
Like I can stay in this more meditative state, or I can consciously put it to bed.
Mm-hmm.
And now, what a gift to basically be able to put my body to bed.
Mm-hmm.
And to notice, like we were describing, if something else was being asked for.
Totally.
And that's pretty beautiful too.
Well, it's beyond the scope of this conversation to get into the different koshas of the body and the different brainwave states and the subtle and causal states of consciousness. But, and lucid dreaming, where you are in a light enough sleep to be semi-aware of what's happening in your mind. But I think that's basically the ground that we're entering here when we talk about, working with insomnia from the perspective of how do I calm down my nervous system to prepare it for deeper sleep later on in the night if for whatever reason I find myself aroused. And I think this is a topic that we'll actually get into a bit deeper in the fifth pillar, which is all around asomatic autonomic neuroregulation.
Something about what you said at the end there does invite some, how can you improve your sleep from a supplementation perspective as well? I mean, on one hand, I think what we're saying is the more dialed in you have the pieces of your life, there's more available, like whether you want to call it a spiritual practice or optimal performance or just thriving. Sleep is an area where that's possible too. And it's really wonderful and beautiful to be able to introduce a practice like lucid dreaming or even just like journaling about your dreams and like seeing the work that's being done there. But I was called to sort of say, what do you like to do to help either calm down the nervous system or deepen sleep from a supplemental perspective? Are there things you recommend to your clients?
Yeah. So within, you can only do three things. You can change your lifestyle, which is really what we're talking about.
Yep.
You can take natural supplements, herbals, nutraceuticals, and you can take drugs.
Yeah.
It's kind of the scope of it. Supplements, there are many. It depends on the unique individual and the type of sleep pattern that they find themselves in. But there are obviously neurotransmitters that are very calming, soothing, relaxing, and sedating. Things like GABA, 5-HTP, adaptogenic herbs that work on adrenal function and cortisol levels. Things like ashwagandha, very, very helpful. And there again, you kind of have to pick, you do have to do some trial and error at different times of life. Different things may be more beneficial. Low dose melatonin can sometimes be super, super helpful, particularly as we age. The pineal gland will calcify eventually and will produce less and less melatonin as time goes on. So it tends to be even more important for people over 60. Magnesium and other salts and minerals, incredible. And magnesium is a whole, topic of conversation because there's so many salts. Yeah. Do I use citrate or glycinate or threonate or malate? It seems that for sleep, glycinate, threonate, and malate are the three that tend to help the most people, and certainly orally. But even bathing in a magnesium bath salt is very, very soothing. So that could be part of a wonderful evening routine.
Absolutely.
Taking a nice hot bath and, again, evoking what we've been talking about this whole time, some of your beautiful images of slowly dimming the lights. Yeah. So candlelight, perfect for kind of that bedtime ritual. So that you're reading that poem, right, without having 50,000 Kelvin blasting down above the tub. So light bulb selection is so important. Like, how do I even do this? Like, do I have to replace all the bulbs? You can replace certain bulbs where you spend most of your time in the evening with the Philips Hue bulb, which syncs to your phone and you can change the color of it with a swipe of your finger anytime you want.
I really like putting fabric over lights, which you have to obviously be careful with if it's not an LED light because
Mhm.
it can get hot, but a red scarf or just it can really make a lovely tone to the room and be a nice way to let things turn down in a very inexpensive way.
Totally. Well, I was going to mention that with my night lights, it was impossible to find a nightlight bulb that was lower than something like 2700 Kelvin, which is about as amber as those lights come, but it's not what you want.
Yeah.
It's still pretty bright white. You would still want to use a blue blocker sunglass, when you're reading with that light. But on Amazon, you can buy sheets of this. It's kind of like plastic cellophane. I forget the exact name. I can post it on the show notes. But, you cut it to whatever shape you want. And that bulb is not so hot that it would melt that. And you can just stick it on top. And I found that to be a super easy solution. Basically, it's an orange filter.
Great.
Yeah. We didn't talk about blue blockers. I think that's so important, back to the light thing. Not just using less screens, but if you are watching a movie and it's, let's say, after 7 or 8 p.m., which we're not going to sit here and tell people never to do, wearing glasses that have those appropriate blue blocking filters is a super easy thing to do.
And being conscious about what you're putting in your mind from the TV or the screen in that time too.
Yes.
And noticing again that different times in your life you might be able to handle that zombie TV show and others that might be creating too much of a stress response in the hours before bed.
You don't recommend World War Z before bedtime?
It depends on your constitution. It depends on how you respond to things. Like, I really enjoy medical shows that would cause a lot of people stress. I find them deeply relaxing. So it's, again, very personal.
Totally. So I guess the last 2 points on sound to wrap with are binaural beats, kind of goes into brain entrainment and allowing us to move into brainwave states that are conducive to deeper sleep. And that's a great, I think, application. iTunes has tons of binaural beats tracks. It doesn't cost any money. And you can do those with or without noise canceling headphones next to the bedside or with headphones. Many people find them to be beneficial to help them drop into that first, particularly if you're struggling in falling asleep.
Yeah, I guess that's one thing we didn't really talk about specifically, is that there can be different elements of sleep to pay attention to. Do you have trouble falling asleep? Do you have trouble in that first phase or the second phase? Is it an issue of waking up at 3 a.m. and not being able to go back to bed? Is it trouble waking up? And as a habit change expert, I would say that addressing each one of those as a separate phenomena can be somewhat useful. And just recognizing that there are solutions, and that even when you find one, it may take some practice for it to become a true habit that offers relief.
Totally. And choosing your adventure, figuring it out, finding what works for you.
It can be fun.
It can be fun. So kind of as like the parting words to summarize everything, figure out for you what are the main sleep killers that are relatively easy to mitigate, to work with, to reduce, if not remove. Considering finding a way to breathe more through the nose than from the mouth. Mouth taping being the obvious thing to try. It's an easy thing to try. It may or may not work for you. Consistency of bedtime and having some kind of a sleep ritual or a bedtime ritual. And then using different types of light to support your circadian rhythm, namely waking up, greeting the sun, as well as limiting some of that. The reason that blue light isn't good is that's the high noon light. That's the light that is blasting into our eyeballs when we're supposed to be fully awake. We do not want that light to be in our realm as much during those evening hours. And that's the whole point of blocking the blues and using more of the amber tones and dimmer lights. And then especially when we're actually in bed, right? That's what you were mentioning with the clock faces and the blackout blinds. And then, using sound both, again, in the positive sense of supporting sleep with binaural beats, as well as sometimes blocking out the unwanted noise. And then supplement-wise, there are many great sleep stacks out there. We at Cloud Medical have a sleep stack that works for, again, not everyone, but for a lot of people. And at the end of the day, I think there's still a smart role for occasional, not long-term use of some of the brilliant pharmacological sleep aids that we have. The main difference there is that the over-the-counter ones tend to cause hangovers, whereas the prescription ones don't. They're very, very clean. So that's always an option to kind of break a bad sleep pattern. Sometimes that's what it takes, is just to say, I'm just in this funky pattern. I don't even know why necessarily. 3 or 4 days with a sleep aid can be very, very restorative from that perspective. So that's kind of in a nutshell. Any party words from you, Katie?
I just want to say that sometimes it's the low-hanging fruit. It's the big hitters that if you can get them right, everything else in your life works really well. And every body is different, but everybody needs sleep.
Everybody needs sleep. Beautiful. Well, thanks again. This was a great conversation, and I hope it was helpful to our audience.
Me too. I think it will be.
All right. Cheers.